and the sensual. So it comes to pass that the soul is in deep prayer with God according to the Spirit. And, on the other hand, according to sense, it is passively conscious, not without great displeasure, of rebellions and motions and acts of the senses, which often happens in communion. For when the soul receives joy and comfort in this act of love, because this Lord bestows it, since it is to that end that he gives himself, the sensual nature takes that which is its own likewise, as we have said, after its manner. Now, as after all these two parts are combined in one individual, they ordinarily both participate in that which one of them receives, each after its own manner. For as the philosopher says, everything that is received is in the recipient after the manner of the same recipient. And thus, in these beginnings, and even when the soul has made some progress, its sensual part, being imperfect, oftentimes receives the Spirit of God with the same imperfection. Now, when this sensual part is renewed by the purgation of the dark night which we shall describe, it no longer has these weaknesses. For it is no longer this part that receives anything, but rather it is itself received into the Spirit. And thus it then has everything after the manner of the Spirit. The second cause from where these rebellions sometimes proceed is the devil, who, in order to disquiet and disturb the soul, at times when it is at prayer or is striving to pray, contrives to stir up these motions of impurity in its nature. And if the soul gives heed to any of these, they cause it great harm. For through fear of these, not only do persons become lax in prayer, which is the aim of the devil when he begins to strive with them, but some give up prayer altogether, because they think that these things attack them more during that exercise than apart from it. Which is true, since the devil attacks them then more than at other times, so that they may give up spiritual exercises. And not only so, but he succeeds in portraying to them very vividly things that are most foul and impure, and at times are very closely related to certain spiritual things and persons that are of profit to their souls, in order to terrify them and make them fearful, so that those who are affected by this dare not even look at anything or meditate upon anything, because they immediately encounter this temptation. And upon those who are inclined to melancholy, this acts with such effect that they become greatly to be pitied, since they are suffering so sadly. For this trial reaches such a point in certain persons, when they have this evil humor, that they believe it to be clear that the devil is ever present with them, and that they have no power to prevent this, although some of these persons can prevent his attack by dint of great effort and labor. When these impurities attack such souls through the medium of melancholy, they are not, as a rule, freed from them until they have been cured of that kind of humor, unless the dark night has entered the soul and rids them of all impurities, one after another. Melancholy is depression. Chapter 5. Of the imperfections into which beginners fall with respect to the sin of wrath. By reason of the concupiscence which many beginners have for spiritual consolations, their experience of these consolations is very commonly accompanied by many imperfections proceeding from the sin of wrath. For when their delight and pleasure in spiritual things comes to an end, they naturally become embittered, and bear that lack of sweetness which they have to suffer with a bad grace, which affects all that they do. And they very easily become irritated over the smallest matter, Sometimes, indeed, no one can tolerate them. This frequently happens after they have been very pleasantly recollected in prayer, according to sense. When their pleasure and delight therein come to an end, their nature is naturally vexed and disappointed, just as the child is when they take it from the breast of which it was enjoying the sweetness. There is no sin in this natural vexation when it is not permitted to indulge itself, but only imperfection, which must be purged by the aridity and severity of the dark night. There are other of these spiritual persons, again, who fall into another kind of spiritual wrath. This happens when they become irritated at the sins of others, and keep watch on those others with a sort of uneasy zeal. At times the impulse comes to them to reprove them angrily, and occasionally they go so far as to indulge it, and set themselves up as masters of virtue. All this is contrary to spiritual meekness. There are others who are vexed with themselves when they observe their own imperfection, and display an impatience that is not humility. So impatient are they about this, that they would like to be saints in a day. Many of these persons purpose to accomplish a great deal, and make grand resolutions. Yet, as they are not humble and do not have misgivings about themselves, the more resolutions they make, the greater their fall is, and the greater their annoyance, since they do not have the patience to wait for what God will give them when it pleases Him. This likewise is contrary to the spiritual meekness aforementioned, which cannot be wholly remedied except by the purgation of the dark night. Some souls, on the other hand, are so patient as regards the progress which they desire, that God would be glad to see them less so. End of chapter 5.